In this video, we'll take a look at section 4.7, which is factoring, a general strategy. So the main concept in this section is just a general strategy for factoring. What to look for and then how to proceed with factoring out the polynomial that's given to you. Now here's the strategy. First, you're going to factor out the GCF. Okay. So take a look at each term and then see if there's a GCF. See if they all have a common factor. If they do, factor that out. Then you want to determine how many terms are in the polynomial. Well, if you have two terms, check and see if it's in the form of a difference of two squares, a difference of two cubes, or a sum of two cubes. And then you'll use the formula in the previous section to factor those out. And if you have three terms, so when you have two terms, this was in section 4.6, is one of those special factorings. You had a formula. If you have three terms, the first form is x squared plus bx plus c. This is equal to x plus m times x plus n, where m plus n is equal to b and m times n is equal to c. So this was when we were factoring out trinomials. This was in section 4.4. Then if it was ax squared plus bx plus c, you either could use the trial and error method or the AC method. This was section 4.5. If you have four terms, you're going to factor by grouping. This was in section 4.3. And then your third and last step, check to see if any of the factors can be factored even further. Let's take a look at some examples. So factor, we have 3y cubed minus 12x squared y. Remember, first step, always look for a GCF. If I look at the 3 and the 12, I know that 3 can go into both of them. But what else do they have in common? They also have at least one y in common. So our GCF here is 3y. So let's go ahead and factor out the 3y and let's see what we have left over. So if I factor out 3y from the first term, I have y squared. If I factor out 3y from the second term, I have minus 4x squared. Now, after you factor out the GCF, take a look at what's left over. So I have this binomial. I want to see if it has one of those special forms. Well, I notice y squared can be written as something to the second power, and so can this 4x squared. So this is a difference of two squares. I can rewrite this as y raised to the second minus 2x raised to the second. And now I can use my formula to factor that out. Okay. So we have our GCF that stays on the outside. And now inside the parentheses, this will factor into y minus 2x and y plus 2x. And then we're all finished. Okay, next problem. Factor, we have 7a cubed minus 7. Remember, start off with the GCF. I notice they both have a 7 in common. I can factor that out. If I factor out the 7, I'm left with a cubed minus 1. Now, a cubed minus 1, so we have two terms here. This is a binomial. And this has the form of a difference of two cubes. As you can see, I can write out a cubed as a raised to the third power minus, and then 1, I can rewrite that as 1 raised to the third power. So now let's go ahead and use our formula and we can factor that out. So this becomes a minus 1 times a squared plus a plus 1. Let's take a look at another one. Okay, factor, we have 6x squared minus 3x minus 18. Okay, look at all three terms. Okay, they don't all have an x in it, so they don't have an x in common, but they all have a factor of 3 in common. So let's go ahead and factor out that 3, and let's see what's left over. So we have 2x squared minus x minus 6. So now we have a trinomial, and notice we have a number in front of our x squared. So this leads us to either using the trial and error method or the AC method. So I'm going to go ahead and try out the trial and error method and see what I come up with. Okay. So the GCF, that's going to stay on the outside. And now this trinomial, if I'm using the trial and error method, I know when I multiply these first two terms together, it has to give me 2x squared. So my only option here is 2x and x. Now when I multiply my last two terms together, it has to give me -6. Okay, so we have to try out some options here. Let's try out -3 here and a +2 right over here. Now we have to check to see if it gives us the correct middle term. Okay. So multiply the inside, you get -3x. Multiply the outside, you get 4x. But this gives us +x, which is not exactly what we're looking for. We want -x. So what I can do to fix this, let's change this to +3, and let's change this one to -2. Now let's see if we get the right middle term. Okay. So if I multiply the inside together, I get +3x. Multiply the outsides, I get -4x. And if I combine these, I get -x, which is exactly the middle term I wanted. So that means that this is the correct factorization. So we have a couple more. Now we have this polynomial with 4 terms. But first, let's take a look and see if they have a GCF. Okay. I notice that these 3 have an A, but this one doesn't. So A is not a GCF. That's not a common factor. Then I notice all 3 of these have a B, but this first term doesn't. So B is not it's not a common factor. So in this case, for this polynomial, there is no GCF. So what we're going to do is go ahead and factor this out by grouping. So we're going to group the first 2 terms, put a plus, and then group the last 2 terms. Okay, so the first 2 terms, I have a cubed minus ab squared. And then my last 2 terms, I have -a squared b plus b cubed. And now let's factor out the GCF from each one. So from the first group, I can factor out an a. I'm left with a squared minus b squared. The second group, I can factor out a -b. And I'm factoring out a -b, so that way I have the same binomial over here. I have a squared minus b squared. So now we have a common binomial of a squared minus b squared. Let's go ahead and factor that out. And then what we have left over is a minus b. Okay. But now in this particular problem, we're not quite finished, because this first binomial, this is a difference of 2 squares. So that could be factored out even further. So we can factor that out further into, we have a minus b times a plus b. We still have this a minus b on the outside. And now it's completely factored. Another way that you can write out this answer is, since we have 2 a minus b's, we can write this out as a minus b squared, and then times a plus b. Okay, one last one. So we want to factor out this binomial. Now first, let's go ahead and check to see what kind of form this has. Let's see if there's a GCF. So if you take a look at 64 and 79, those don't have a common factor. Also x, the first term has x's, the second one has y's, so there's no common factor here. So now we have to see what kind of form does this have. Okay. Now for this particular problem, you could actually write this out a couple ways. You could either write it out as a difference of 2 cubes or a difference of 2 squares. Now just remember, whenever you're given the option, whenever you're able to write it out in 2 different ways, always start with the difference of 2 squares first. It's going to make your life a whole lot easier. So 64 x cubed, x to the 6th, I can rewrite this as 8x to the 3rd raised to the 2nd. And I have minus the 729. This could actually be written as 27y to the 3rd raised to the 2nd. So we have a difference of 2 squares. So let's go ahead and use our formula to factor that out. So we have 8x cubed minus 27y cubed. and then times 8x cubed plus 27y cubed. So let's take a look at what's left over. Now, each one of these binomials, so the first one, this is a difference of 2 cubes. So I can rewrite this as 2x raised to the third power minus 3y raised to the third power. So it has the form of a difference of 2 cubes, and another one has the form of a sum of 2 cubes. So each one of these can be factored out even further. So now we have to use the difference of 2 cubes formula, and then the sum of 2 cubes formula. Okay, so let's begin with the difference of 2 cubes. So factoring it out, we have 2x minus 3y times, we have 4x squared plus 6xy plus 9y squared. Now we're done with that difference of two cubes. Now the sum of 2 cubes, using our formula, we have 2x plus 3y times, write it below it, we have 4x squared minus 6xy plus 9y squared. So now let me go ahead and rewrite our final answer. So I'm just going to rewrite it with the binomials going first. So I have 2x minus 3y times 2x plus 3y times, now I'm going to write out the trinomials, 4x squared plus 6xy plus 9y squared times 4x squared minus 6xy plus 9y squared. And then we're completely finished. So that last example, a little bit difficult because you had to first use its difference of 2 squares formula, and then you go ahead and use this difference of 2 cubes and the sum of 2 cubes. Okay. So that was it for 4.7. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. Please email me.